Welcome everybody. Welcome to the International IHRM Webinar Series. Wonderful to see you all here today. This series is a collaboration that happens between a number of institutions. So we have Simon Fraser University, the Center for Global Workforce Strategy. We have the Center for International HR Studies at Penn State. We have the ESCP Business School based out of both Germany and France represented. We have RIT Croatia, and we have Penn West University in the US. Basically, we're a group of scholars who are fascinated by international HR and want to spread the word, shall we say. So my name's Elaine Farndale. I am at the Center for International Human Resource Studies at Penn State in the US, and I'm the moderator for today's session. We started doing these webinars back in the pandemic. It feels so good to say back in the pandemic, and as much as we're, move forward. But we had such a lot of interest in these, and it's so convenient for people who can actually be here today, but also people who can check out all the recordings of these webinars on our YouTube channel. So we are actually up to our 31st one of these webinars. Can you believe it? If you've missed any, go to the YouTube channel and you can see all the recordings there. But it's a great chance for us to hear of leading experts in the international HR field, letting us know what the latest research is that they're working on, not waiting 2 years until it gets into a journal. So great opportunity for us. And today is no exception. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you today Professor Snežina Michailova. And Snežina is going to be talking to us about modern slavery, a very interesting topic, and why HR scholars should, try that again, why HR scholars should care. I didn't realize it was a tongue twister till just then. Okay, so let me introduce Snežina to you. Snežina has a doctorate from Copenhagen Business School in Denmark, and she's a professor of international business at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. She researches people and knowledge-related issues in organizations and multinationals in particular, and some of her very impressive work is on theory and methodology. One of her current lines of scholarly inquiry is modern slavery, as we'll hear about today. She's published more than 100 articles, with her work appearing in a whole range of top scholarly journals, including an Academy of Management Review, Journal of International Business Studies, British Journal of Management, and I could go on. But Snežina has also co-authored and co-edited several books, including the 2024 A Guide to Key Theories for Human Resource Management, something that I wish I'd had a number of years ago, so great to see that being published. She also has served in various editorial roles and has received numerous international research awards. In 2023, she became the president of the Australia and New Zealand International Business Academy, ANZIBA, and she also serves as Associate Dean of Research in her business school. So we're delighted to have you here today, Snežina, to talk on this very interesting topic. So if people have questions, please note that the chat facility isn't live, but we have Q&A open. So as we go through the presentation, if you put your questions or comments in Q&A, then toward the end of the hour, we will start addressing those questions. So please put your questions there. So on that note, I will hand over to you, Snežina.
Thank you, Elaine, and the other members of the organizing team for inviting me to contribute to this webinar series. And thank you also for introducing me. And thank you to everyone who is joining here today. Maybe before I start the very presentation, I will allow myself to put forward an opening remark, which I think is quite an important one. So Elaine mentioned that, experts are invited to this webinar series, but I should probably highlight that I consider myself very much to be a student of modern slavery. So I consider myself as someone who is really actually deeply concerned about the reality of modern slavery. And because of that, as someone who is really eager to learn more about it. And then I realized, like with everything else, the more you learn, the more actually you realize how much more there is to learn and how little you know about that. So modern slavery is a very big topic. So I have chosen a few themes only to focus on, and I will share a few of my views on a few selected issues. And so to do this within the time frame that we have available for this particular webinar, I have composed my presentation in to address 3 points. First, what is modern slavery? I will briefly kind of talk about some definitional issues. So I'll present a few definitions, but I will also talk a little bit about what are the issues associated with those definitions. I will present you with a kind of a continuum of modern slavery, and I will put forward a few myths that are out there about modern slavery. Then I will try to kind of convince you and develop the argument that modern slavery is a business, and it is also an international business. And so that will provide me with a platform to actually tackle the actual topic. And this is HR scholarship, human resources scholarship, and modern slavery. And so to address this last point, I will try to answer the question why we should care more than we do at present. How can we care, and what can we do? One, in our research, but also in our classrooms and as members of our respective universities. So I should start by saying that I would say, unfortunately, but that's nothing new to us scholars, there is no universally accepted definition, even actually in legal terms. So there is nothing that tells us this is what it is. And the fact that it's not even well defined in legal terms could probably explain to some extent, at least, why is it so difficult in reality to prosecute actually cases of modern slavery. But typically when we talk about modern slavery, it is viewed to include different things. And so it does include forced, bonded, and child labor. It also often is treated to include human trafficking, sex trafficking, forced marriage, and so on. So you can see these are practices that are not necessarily based on legal ownership. So slavery, modern slavery, is no longer about someone legally owning someone else. And so a kind of a way to think about modern slavery is actually to think about a form of an extreme appropriation of labor power, if you wish. And so it is a kind of an umbrella for an umbrella term. Here I have put forward a diagram that is trying to convey that there is actually a range of different practices. And so you can see they vary from serious, colored in blue, to extreme, that you can see colored in red. And you can also see from the diagram that there is actually no clear, strict demarcation line between these two, and so they are quite intertwined. And what I have put here in the bottom of this particular slide is that we can think of those components of modern slavery as different varieties of unfreedom. So nevertheless, there are some definitions. There are many actually, but I have chosen a few of those. So one very well accepted one is viewing modern slavery to be a state marked by the loss of free will, where a person is forced through violence or the threat of violence to give up the ability to sell freely their own labor power. Another one would refer to modern slavery as a severe exploitation of other people for personal or commercial gain. Together with colleagues from the Center for Research on Modern Slavery at my university, this is a center that I had kind of the honor actually to be a co-founding member of. We often define modern slavery as a condition in which workers are kept against their will in an abusive employment relationship. And we also point out, for the purposes of our research, that modern slavery is a profoundly offensive characteristic of the contemporary global economy. So you can see in that particular definition, we try actually to address the phenomenon at two different levels, right? At the level of the employment relationship and then the macro level of global economy. Now, I can go on and on and on with definitions. We have developed tables, many different files. We have looked at a lot of different papers, books, book chapters. And so there are really plenty of definitions. But I would like just to highlight that the term is really contested, and it is surrounded actually by a number of quite serious, I would say, definitional issues. But modern slavery does imply that some modification is actually required to the notion of slavery in order to make it modern slavery. So as I have pointed out, we don't any longer talk about someone legally owning someone else. I would also like to draw your attention to the fact that there are alternative terms out there. So one would be slavery-like practices. This is a bit of a softer term as compared to modern slavery. And there are the other two, modern-day slavery and contemporary slavery. And so these two, modern-day slavery and contemporary slavery, one could actually argue that they are more exact terms because they contain the temporality of the phenomenon. And so if we say modern-day slavery or contemporary slavery, that actually indicates quite clearly that we differentiate that from historical slavery. One thing I think that I have learned over the last few years to pay quite close attention to is that we need to really pay kind of good attention to both the ontological and the epistemological stance within which a particular piece on modern slavery is embedded. So how we actually, what is modern slavery? What constitutes modern slavery? What are its components? What can be studied as modern slavery? And then ultimately or consequently, how we ought to actually respond to modern slavery is very much a question of ontology and epistemology. And so I think sometimes the confusion between or dealing with different definitions is related to the fact that we probably don't situate that in a close relation to the research question that we are trying to answer, which on its own is then embedded in a particular ontological and epistemological stance. So for instance, to give an example, so if a research question is centered around trying to understand and interpret modern slavery as a management practice, that would kind of, if not determine, then influence quite strongly what would be considered to be modern slavery. And so if that is the topic of the research question, if that is what the research question is focused on, then forced labor, bonded labor would be very much, entailed in modern slavery, but that particular piece would probably not look into human trafficking, sex trafficking, forced marriage, and so on and so forth. So I think it's quite important to put that forward. Now, a kind of a more probably fine-grained way to look at or understand what modern slavery is to look at what characterizes it. And so I have put a few components of it, and I'll very briefly go through them. So one is, when we talk about modern slavery, we do imply that there is a control of another person. Also, someone is treated as not as a human being, but as a commodity. This someone is forced to work in working conditions that we can clearly define as inhumane. There is restrictions on movement, so people can't move freely, maybe because they have been deprived from their identity documents or for other reasons. As I have pointed out in one of the definitions, there is violence or considerable threat of violence. When it comes to contracts, those contracts are either not there, they are non-existent, or they are really unstable, or they are falsified. Or sometimes people will be forced to work with two versions of a contract. And sometimes a contract would be issued in a language where the laborer doesn't understand. And when we talk about wages, either they absolutely don't exist or they are just minimal, meager. So I should probably also say that these are intertwined, and I'm not suggesting that all of them, all seven, need to be there for us to define a condition as a modern slavery. But most of them should be present. And so I think it would be good that, if you listen to this for first time and you are confronted with the topic of modern slavery for first time, I think one needs to be really careful, when we all now and then use the metaphor of slaving or being a slave, right? So anyway, so when we talk about modern slavery, we do talk about the lack of freedom to move, the lack of freedom to exit an existing employment relationship, and also no freedom to contest the working conditions under which one is put to act. And I would also argue very clearly that modern slavery is clearly a deliberate, brutal, and I have put here on the slide, a cynical to its core violation of human rights. And I think you would probably agree with me looking at all the characteristics that I have put forward. Now, there are actors involved in modern slavery. We have the exploiter, we have the victim, and we have the intermediary. An intermediary could, for instance, be a recruitment agent. And then I have put something else here towards the end of the slide, and this is just to kind of alert you to a vocabulary that we are using, in our business studies. So when we talk about supplies and supply chains, we automatically imply that we are talking about commodities. But when we talk about modern slavery, we actually talk about supplying human beings. And so the notion of actually human supply chain has started appearing here and there. Not yet, I think, in published work, but elsewhere. There are actually many myths about modern slavery, so I will tackle only a few of them. One of them is that slavery is a matter of the past, and it's almost non-existent or is negligible nowadays. And that is simply incorrect. It exists, and it doesn't just exist, it actually thrives. And to this point, I would like actually to also say that there are a lot of estimates out there. There are a number of indices. So one of them is the so-called Global Slavery Index. And we do read about the statistics that they put forward. So for instance, in 2018, it was reported that in 2016, we had almost 40 million people who lived in modern slavery at any given day. And then the latest estimate from 2023 actually told us that in 2021, the number of enslaved people has increased from 40 to nearly 50 million people. Now, this is a tricky issue because these are not hard validated data. And so there are several estimates out there, and they vary quite considerably. And so I would like to emphasize that. So the estimates vary all the way from 12 all the way up to 50 million people. And so this is an issue. Now, I think the statistics is probably not the important issue here. I think there are at least two issues that I, in particular, or I personally find much more important than the numbers. And probably one of them is the fact that there is an enormous suffering and humiliation and tragedy, in which or to which human beings are exposed and in which they find themselves, that is caused by others. And maybe another issue, quite related actually to the first one, is the relationship that we have between suffering and this big, I would say again, enormous drive for profitability. And I'll touch upon that a little bit later. So another myth is that modern slavery is only present in less developed countries and informal economies. And again, this is not true. European countries, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, all have modern slavery networks operating within their borders. And many countries, many well-developed Western countries do actually are the destinations of multinational enterprises in which we can find traces of modern slavery in their supply chains. So no country or economy is immune to modern slavery. Is it that modern slavery is only present in labor-intensive industries like agriculture, construction, fishing, mining? No, not really. It's also found in high fashion, in medical equipment, jewelry, electronics, and many other sectors and industries. And finally, for the purposes of this presentation, and I have already alerted to this, modern slavery does not entail necessarily or only physical entrapment. In fact, it is so sophisticated that it actually contains a lot of very, very refined, exceptionally refined exploitation arrangements. So against these myths, I think we will be not stretched actually to be able to argue that modern slavery is systemic, it is structural, and it is universal. Now, about the business of modern slavery. So we will not we will not be able to minimize, let alone eradicate, modern slavery in our world, I think, if we don't really understand it and if we don't study it as a business. It is a business, and it is a highly profitable business. In fact, it is one of the most profitable businesses in the world. And so the return on investment of modern slavery is exceptionally high, and that makes it very attractive. Okay, so if it is attractive, it will be more of it. This is a kind of, by now, outdated statistics, but I'm not familiar with something that is more recent in that space. An estimated $150 billion profit is obtained annually from slavery. And so if that was registered to be the case in 2016, you can imagine several years later, the number could be substantially higher. Now, to the international part of the business, I have argued elsewhere that modern slavery is international business. It does cross borders. And there are two things in particular we have to pay attention to. One is globalization. Globalization, as we have it at the moment, and as we have had it for a few decades by now, is one of the key drivers of increasing the number of enslaved people. And the other one is the fact that modern slavery is present in supply chains. It is hidden, but it is out there. And so here I would probably summarize that by saying that the complex nature of supply chains does go some way to obscure slavery. But at the same time, that actually does not mean that multinational enterprises, right, MNEs, are always unaware of the use of slave labor in their respective supply chains. So why is it there? Well, there are a number of factors. So I have clustered just a few of them. One is this huge kind of drive to minimize costs and to go for models that are about revenue maximization. There is also this extreme pursuit of flexibility and the pressure on wages and conditions that goes down and down and down the tiers of M&E's supply chains. There is also the highly fragmented nature of production, and also the urge to externalize low-value activities and activities that are deemed to be risky. In addition to that is the complexity of the M&E supply chains, and not only the complexity of the chains as such, but also the complexity of how those chains are governed, and the detached responsibility associated with all of the above. And now, if we add to this the lack of commitment in general of many states and their prosecutors to pursue labor violation cases, and also, as I pointed out earlier, the substantial, enormous profits from modern slavery, then I think it's clear that we have a kind of a perfect storm, I would say. So, bearing that in mind, I think many of you would probably think maybe we should care more than we do at present. But I will nevertheless allow myself to put forward a few more reasons for why we should care. Slavery can and actually does creep into the employment relationship. And so if it does that, then it is an inherently HR issue. And it's an issue that imposes actually an irony that is an immediate one, and it's also an ugly one, in the sense that, you know, the H is absolutely absent, it's missing, it's not there, because there is actually absolutely nothing human about slavery. And it all turns out to be about the R, about the resources, meaning exploiters treating people as commodities, as resources, and you know, either directly or through more refined mechanisms and by employing intermediaries or recruiters. Why should we study it? Because it matters. And as I mentioned, you know, we will never get there in terms of decent work for all or ending modern slavery if we don't tackle it also through our research. And I do wonder, as we all collectively wonder in respect to other issues and other topics that we tackle, are we as HR scholars lagging behind others like policymakers, activists, legislators? And this is a number that I found a little bit confronting, that, you know, and again, it's probably an outdated one by now, but nearly 3,000 anti-slavery organizations are operating both within countries and internationally. And I do wonder, how many scholars are we? How many conferences do we have devoted to modern slavery? How many times do we see modern slavery as a topic in well-established conferences and seminars and so on and so forth? Now, if you agree that we should care, then the question is, well, how can we care? And what can we do in our research? And here's my take on this. I think, and I'm not alone in kind of that call, we should really try to kind of unite efforts and try to tackle the M&E, the multinational enterprise, in different ways. So the M&E has been and is, and I guess it will always be, you know, a central unit of analysis for if not all of us, many of us. But I do think that by far most of our research has focused on issues related to competitiveness, financial performance, what leads to financial performance, and related to that, far less on what do actually M&Es and their respective operations, what do they mean for workers' human rights? So it would be good to start thinking about getting somewhat of a balance here. And while we will continue doing the traditional research that we have been doing for a while, it is probably, and we are late, I think, but we should really push this other part that we haven't paid much attention to yet. Another thing that I would suggest we do, if we decide to tackle the topic of modern slavery, is to bring another type of balance. And this is related to the fact that by far most of the research on modern slavery has been focused on the victims. And intuitively that may make sense, but we do need more research and more serious research on the other actors. And this would be the exploiters and the intermediaries. I think it is quite important to take descriptive work, conceptual work, and theoretical work quite seriously. So I'm not suggesting that we should rush and start investigating empirically something that we actually don't understand that well yet in our own discipline. So I would say clearly yes to good, solid, sound descriptions. At the same time, I don't think we should shy away in any way from kind of more firm normative language and prescriptions. I do think we need to engage in a serious conceptual work, and I may be in the minority here, but I do think that there's plenty of constructs and concepts we can work with that are already there, and so I don't think we should be attempting really to find new flash terms for a well-established phenomenon. When it comes to theoretical work, I would probably have a kind of the same way of thinking and arguing. I don't think we should be in a hurry to try to develop new theories. I think we have plenty of those out there that we can utilize in a way we haven't actually utilized earlier. So we have wonderful theoretical tools in our toolbox, and so we just have to dedust some of them or refresh some of them, or just modify some of those tools and see how we can use them as a lens, as a tool to understand better modern slavery. And then, only then, I would argue, we can carefully design our empirical studies. And just very briefly on that, I do think that here, differently from what I argued in relation to concepts, constructs, and theories, here I think we need to be more innovative or think differently and creatively in terms of how we actually design empirically our studies in order to tackle the phenomenon. What else can we do? I think it's quite important that we don't hide behind, as I said just before, new flash terms that sound good, sound attractive, or kind of refined vocabulary. I think it's quite important to use straightforward language and, not kind of hide or convolute or excuse or camouflage. But I don't think that should be confused with being insensitive. So yes, straightforward, but that does not mean, brutal and insensitive. I think it's quite important to, when we engage in research on modern slavery, is to actually reflect on our positionality as scholars and as human beings when we engage in research on modern slavery. I think it's quite helpful, actually. It's somewhat interrogating and it hurts, but it is very, very useful and very helpful to ask, who are we? Where are we? What has shaped our thinking, for instance, about modern slavery? How do we view different processes and phenomena associated with modern slavery based on who we are? How do we relate to the topic? How do we relate to our research participants, if we have those? And also, we need to be very careful about and sensitive to the language that they use, and afterwards focus on the language that we use. So, for instance, if we happen to talk with or interview victims of modern slavery, do we call them slaves? Probably not, because we know from the literature that they don't define themselves as slaves. They don't talk about themselves as slaves. And so I think it is quite important to really, really be careful and hence not rush. I do think that we should stop publishing one article after the other, one editorial after the other on that we actually need to do the research. And I think it's about time that we actually do the research. I think we need to have the courage to start new scholarly conversations. And we know also from existing studies on that matter that if we do that, it is likely that we will not make it often to the very top ranked journals. Of course, there are some exceptions to that. Now, you may think, well, that all sounds good, but what about the challenges that we face when we conduct research on modern slavery? There are several, just a few. It is a phenomenon that is hidden in plain sight, but it is hidden. There is not much published research within our own discipline on which we can build and to which we can relate. I alerted you to the fact that publicly available data is typically estimates, and that's what they are. And then on top of that, we have issues related to the so-called national sensitivity and other related issues. I do find that ethics approval procedures at many universities don't help. In fact, I would rather argue they prohibit us sometimes from doing such research. So there's a lot of work to be done on that. It is confrontational. When I have started a few years ago educating myself on the topic, you actually feel really exhausted mentally and emotionally. Now, in our discipline, it's not that often that you read and you simply can't breathe any longer. In extreme case, you cry and you need to just leave that article and go somewhere. But I think many people who engage with that go through that. Or you go to the supermarket and you walk down the aisles and you look and you study the labels and you realize, well, there's nothing you can buy because now you know more about it. And I think we find that also with some of our research assistants who are typically younger people. It may be really, and usually is very confrontational for them. And so this is, I think, a big challenge. So it's difficult to distance yourself from what you are confronted with. So it's difficult to kind of separate the brain and the heart. And also one can be intimidated when engaging in research on modern slavery. And there are some kind of reflective pieces where scholars have written about that. And it is quite easy and sometimes I would say tempting to make quick judgments, and that is not what we should be doing. Now I will, I can see I have just a few more minutes. And so this is in a nutshell about why we should do the research and how we can do it and what are the challenges we can expect. And just very briefly, in terms of what we can do in our classrooms, because this is where I think we can have a really serious impact. I think what we can do as HR scholars is to start including sessions on modern slavery in our IHRM classes. We can introduce modern slavery as a topic for supervision, and we can do that quite actively. We can use our classrooms as a good platform for practitioners to come and share their insights into modern slavery, what they do about it and how they do it in their everyday lives. We can offer awareness training, and some universities like the University of Queensland is doing that. More broadly, as members of our universities, I think there's a lot we can consider doing. So one is to relate more critically to the role that our universities play in the global value chains. You see, we often talk about those global value chains and we talk about businesses and companies and multinationals, but what about our own workplaces? We can also, for those universities that have in particular overseas satellites, especially when they are in less developed countries, we can start questioning our upper echelons. Well, how are the so-called migrant laborers paid? How are they treated? Has our university negotiated to the best of their ability a fair agreement for them? And if our universities realize they haven't been able to do that, maybe we should press them to actually pull out of those destinations. In fact, it was actually last week in Times Higher Education, there was a short piece by two scholars from Georgetown University. They have a campus in Qatar, like 5 other US universities. So one of them is a professor in philosophy, the other one is in comparative literature, I think it was. And they wrote a piece basically reflecting on what Georgetown University is doing in Qatar, what is the good things they have done, and what is more to be done. And there is a lot more to be done. We can question, we are employees of our workplaces, the procurement practices of our universities. And I think quite importantly, we can offer important external stakeholders businesses, business people, policymakers, the intelligence that we have that we can base on our research on modern slavery to them. And so that actually they would find it hard to continue to claim ignorance. And I think in general, we can increase awareness of the existence of modern slavery and its spread. Now, you know, I'm based in New Zealand. I know about some of the things that are happening in Australia and obviously also in New Zealand. But I have put here just one photo you can see. This is an art exhibition at UTS, the University of Technology in Sydney, where you have a lot of goods that we buy on an everyday basis, but instead of prices, there are actually names of people there. And so visitors do report that that's, again, quite confronting. And then the University of Queensland, I think they are doing a fantastic job. They have issued, and they have been issuing every year, the so-called UQ modern slavery statement. They have training, awareness training. They have a risk assessment tool. All employees get a newsletter. They have established an anti-slavery working group. So there is quite a bit that can be done, and we should do. So I think this is it from me. I can finish by saying that HR scholarship on modern slavery is much needed, and it is all worth it. And we should probably remember that HR does not only stand for human resources, it actually does stand also for human rights. So thank you for listening, and over to you, Elaine.
Thank you so much, Snedina. That was amazing. I hope we have about 3 hours to discuss this, because there are plenty of things for us to talk about.
At least.
Yeah, at least. 3 years would be good. There are a number of questions coming in, so I'm going to have to just filter through and grab a few for us to address. Sure. There are a couple of positioning questions I'd like to start with, and then an empirical one. So the first kind of positioning piece comes from Stacey Fitzsimmons. It says, you're spending a lot of time lobbying for this topic to be seen as an international HR and international business issue. I'm guessing you've seen some pushback against that idea in the past. I'd love to hear what arguments people have made to say that this topic does not belong in IB research.
Many different arguments, I would say, and often they would be packaged in terms of, yeah, but how do you position that topic in existing research? Well, if there is not much of an existing research, right, then it's really difficult, you know, to relate to, right? And as I mentioned earlier, I think we have probably, if not all of us, many of us have experienced what it means to start a new scholarly conversation, right? Now, if you imagine, just try to imagine visually a big room with a lot of people put together, you know, that have put themselves together in different groups. And imagine that all these groups are scholarly conversations that are taking place and have been taking place for many, many years, right? And yes, some are newer rather than others. Some groups are bigger, that would be more mature, longer term conversations, and some would be kind of smaller and more fresh ones. But just imagine yourself coming into such a big room, entering the room and say, hi, everyone, I want to start a new group, right? That, I mean, you can imagine, you look, if I'm a member of such a group, I'm like, and who are you? And why should we suddenly start a new group? Look at all the groups that we already have, right? So, and here we have the dilemma. Do we start a new bold conversation, let's say in HR or in the international HR, or do we instead try to identify those groups within the big room that would be more willing to listen, that would probably associate with the language, with the logic, and that would pay attention to a voice that comes and says, okay, it is actually worth, you know, having that conversation, right? So yeah, I don't want to go into the issue of peer review and, you know, who are the peers, right? We expect our peers to know more than we do as authors and so on. But I also do know, and we know from, you know, the history of science, that this is what is happening, right? So if we push not just individually but collectively, there are number of clusters, a number of research centers, so there are groups of people, there's a lot of collaboration taking place. So I think this will change, but I do find it has been hard until now.
Makes it, and maybe the second question kind of speaks to this a little bit as well, to give a kind of road into this. So Mevan Jayasingh says, you made an excellent point about how this is an inherently HR issue, but I found most HR and management audiences, like journals and conferences, they tend to push this topic away, classifying it as CSR or sustainability. And this is not Mevan's words, this is my words now, I would throw employment relations there as well, an ER topic rather than HR. So Mevan goes on to say, leaving aside more recent efforts to study the HR-CSR intersection, what are your thoughts on getting the international HRM literature and scholars to recognize that inherent relevance of modern slavery and other global supply chain labor standards research?
Yes, I think it's a really good question. It's also a complex one. So just probably a few highlights from me. I experienced the same, right? So if you decide to kind of position a particular study on modern slavery in the HR, right? It's like, well, it's CSR. Well, it is not, okay? So, you know, starting to kind of blur together or intersect to an extreme kind of extent, to the extent that it doesn't make any longer sense to frame everything as CSR research, is not going to help us. So what is wrong with actually putting forward a topic, a quite well-defined topic, with a particular research question or set of research questions, and position that in HRM? Do not tell me to position that in the CSR literature, okay? It's not the conversation that I join. It is there, it's there. I don't want that piece to be positioned in that. And so, you know, and I think it's about time that, you know, whatever we submit is treated, and maybe we should do, I should say, obviously, we should do a better job, obviously, in positioning that. But is it now so that we explicitly have to say this is not a CSR piece? You know, for both editors and reviewers to realize, okay, let's leave that space elsewhere, right? So yes, it is an inherently HR issue. And our HR journals, not just the more critically oriented ones, but the mainstream ones, need to really wake up and take that seriously.
Thank you. Let me throw an empirical question your way now. And this comes from Mila Mazarova. So the question is, what is your ideal first study? Like a specific study? What would be the first empirical piece that you would do, or perhaps have already started doing?
I have engaged in one empirical study that I found fascinating. The data was not collected by me. That particular study was trying to understand the role of intermediaries and how they are implicated in modern slavery. And so we worked with different sources of data, different types of data. And because I was not involved in the very data collection, it did allow me to have a kind of the analytical distance, but I found that fascinating. Okay. And to try to uncover through a number of interviews, a number of you know, observations by someone in our team, while someone was actually shooting a movie, right? And triangulate different data from the data from different sources. And I thought that was fascinating because you could revisit again and again and again this data to unpack something that is so camouflaged, right? And if I have to put together the exploiter, the victim, and the intermediary, I did say most on the victim, and then I would say then we have something on the exploiters, but far from enough on the intermediary. And I think this is a fascinating thing to study. It's almost like studying our middle managers, right? They are between the two, and also the temporality of what we discovered, how they were engaged. So it wasn't just recruiting, but how they recruited and what happened after someone exited somehow the relationship and how they continued, right, to be after the victim and so on. So that was fascinating. In an ideal world, I wouldn't need to seek, I think, ethics approval. I would do everything possible, and I think it is possible to get to different actors involved and have conversations, not necessarily interviews, and collect data for a long period of time before I say something sensible. So I do think it's quite important to take our time. That's why I argued for, let's first find out who is who, what is what, try to put together concepts and constructs, try to contemplate about certain relationships, and only then go and see, well, how do they actually play out, right? Otherwise, we can't ask the right questions. So, yeah.
I was going to try squeeze one last question in, but I think we're going to run out of time, unfortunately. I will give a comment. I'll share with you a comment, which is exactly on that time issue. This is a comment from Jared Barayes. Modern slavery calls for immediate action. Shouldn't we focus on action rather than research? The time frames for research are long and slavery can continue meanwhile. So maybe we can leave that as a final thought out there. That there are a number of other very interesting questions on this topic. So I'm sure this is not the last time we are going to hear about modern slavery in international HR research. So thank you so much for raising this topic today. It is a field just waiting to open up. So yes, thank you so much for all of your insights today. I would like, sorry, Snejina, can I just ask you to stop sharing your screen for a moment? We will be holding our next webinar on April the 23rd. It'll appear on your screen in one moment. We will have Dan Capra speaking on the complexity of who we are using an identity lens in international HRM studies. I think questioning who we are is a great question to raise at the end of this particular session we had today. If you look in the chat, you will see a link to get you there to register for that event. A reminder that you can find recordings of all of our webinars, and Snejina's webinar will appear within a couple of weeks, available on our YouTube channel. And then I just have a couple of very quick last announcements. And this information will appear in the chat as well. The 6th Global Conference on International HRM, we're organizing in Sweden, Gothenburg University. There's an extended submission deadline that expires on Sunday. So if you want to submit an extended abstract for that conference, please do so quickly now. And final announcement, special issue at the European Management Journal, Managing the Invisible, the Challenges of Religious Expression in the Workplace. The submission deadline, you've got a bit more time for that, it's April 29th. So thank you again to everybody for attending today. Extra special thank you to Snejina Mikhailova for a very thought-provoking, a very interesting presentation today. Wishing you all the best and see you at the next webinar. So thanks very much, everybody. Take care and goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks.